Hello, my friends. Welcome back. I am Jacqueline Clare, spiritual realism, painter, podcaster, and illustrator, and I'm here with another Baha'i-inspired video, this time highlighting and reviewing the work of another burgeoning podcaster, Substacker, YouTuber, Mehrtash Olson, and his series, Skepticism, Sources of Information, and the Pursuit of Truth. Alexander Solzhenitsyn was a Soviet dissident, and while working in a forced Siberian labor camp, he had a lot of time to reflect on how his society got where it was. And he has become one of our preeminent historical voices speaking out against tyrannical government, but he lays a lot of responsibility with the people. The ordinary, day-to-day people who did not have the moral courage, who were not paying enough attention, who did not rally themselves to resist this situation from happening. And Alexander Solzhenitsyn says that truth eludes us if we do not concentrate our attention totally on its pursuit. And this is really the impetus for this wonderful series by Mehrtash Olson, Skepticism, Sources of Information, and the Pursuit of Truth. He makes a case that what we need to do is arm ourselves with what he calls intellectual self-defense. As we are swimming in a sea, we are absolutely inundated with information, with media of various forms that is, in fact, highly sophisticated. If you're not familiar with Edward Bernays, he was the nephew of Sigmund Freud. And over 100 years ago, he applied the theories and discoveries of Sigmund Freud to very practical purposes. He was hired by private companies and government entities to push products and push ideas on an unsuspecting public, using sophisticated psychological methods of manipulation. And again, I repeat, he was highly effective in his work. We are now a century past, and you know that this type of work has only become more refined, more practiced, and more sophisticated. And now we don't just have a newspaper, we don't just have little, crinkly video reels. We have broadcast media, we have social media, we have our little devices. So we are constantly receiving this very sophisticated form of propaganda and media. And that is why we need to understand the world in which we live, understand this situation, and take responsibility for our intellectual and moral state of being, to understand the forces at play here so that we know that our opinions and our views and even our thoughts are truly our own, because the information we receive affects our thoughts, our opinions, and it affects our behaviors and our prejudices. So it's extremely important, and that's what this series is all about. I'm going to be giving you, again, a summary, a review, very broad brushstrokes. This is a very well-researched presentation or series that Mehrtash has put together, and I have the links below. I want you to check out, read the Substack, listen to the YouTube. He has all of his sources of information wonderfully laid out. I'm going to continue with some of the things that really stood out to me, again, in this Jacqueline Clare sort of broad brushstroke, right brain kind of way. So one of the first things is that we are not only very susceptible to narrative, we love stories, but we also are attracted to things that feel official, that seem polished and professional. If it's professional, then it must be trustworthy. And sadly, that's not true. That's not the world in which we live. All forms of major media are businesses, and they are made up of individuals with their own moral situations. They also have business ties, and sometimes they even are there to push government policies without you even realizing it. So all network media has some conflict of interest. All cable and network news, any major newspaper, NPR, all of these are sources to be somewhat skeptical of, to understand that they are machines and there are mechanisms behind the scenes that do not necessarily have your best interests at heart. Often you are actually not the customer. You are something that is being delivered to the customer. And here you need to arm yourself with that knowledge and with that intellectual self-defense. And even newswire services like Reuters and AP, and that was one of the most shocking parts for me listening to and reading this series, that both of these have taken large donations from USAID. And the one from Reuters even said in the contract that it was for large-scale social deception. These things are like right out there. It sounds like tinfoil hat world, but this is very well documented and it's out there, as is everything I'm going to mention. So some of the other things that are mentioned in this series that you might find interesting: Operation Mockingbird, which was a CIA-funded operation to use journalists to forward certain government policies. And Operation Mockingbird was investigated by Congress, and it supposedly ended. Yet, if you've ever seen one of those composites of newscasters from various different networks, all saying the exact same script, pretty much, it feels like there's still a coordinated effort, that there is still a Mockingbird situation going on. And as I mentioned, this is Baha'i-inspired, so it always comes back to the moral and spiritual responsibility that people have as sovereign beings, and that the Baha'i writings talk so much about taking responsibility, seeing through your own eyes. Even Abdu'l-Baha says in The Secret of Divine Civilization that we need to question the motives of people who convey information to us, and admits that sometimes people have selfish motives and that we have to be aware of that and we have to question what we receive. Ruhiya Khanum said of The Guardian that he was very discerning and he was very skeptical about information he received, that he took it upon himself to educate himself about the affairs of the world. And she used this wonderful phrase, something like he didn't have a childish complacency or a false sense of faith. He used his noggin and he used a degree of skepticism to truly investigate the reality around him. Another thing that is brought up in this series is something called fifth generation warfare, kind of related to Bernays. This is the idea that we have moved beyond tactical war, we've even moved beyond economic war, and that the battleground now is truly for your mind. It's a battle of ideas, it's a battle of narratives. And Edward Bernays, he said that manipulation is important for any democratic society, and that the invisible government was the true ruling power. So not only does every nation have their own government, perhaps enacting this on their own citizens, but then you have the contention between different nations utilizing all of these ideas that have been in circulation and refinement for a very long time now. So he also goes into Google and Alphabet, which is the parent company, and Facebook and Meta. And this is another situation where you think you're the customer. It's fun to use, it's practical to use, we use it, but it's actually not for us. It's very interesting if you look into the seed funding for these companies, you look into their current employees and the strange ties and connections and overlap with intelligence agencies, and that these are fun to use, but that it's a mechanism for gathering information on you. really without your conscious consent. That information is then sold, and then that information is used to manipulate you. So they gather, they sell, and they use, and they can also censor. So it narrows the scope of the information you are allowed to receive. And that is a very key theme here. So it's what you do receive, and it's also what is vilified or outright censored or blocked from you. And I just want to emphasize here that this is not like doom and gloom, because the whole point here is intellectual self-defense. You become aware of these things, and you can do some of your own diligence to navigate around it. But if you don't know that it's happening, then you are sort of like a lamb headed for the slaughter, maybe or maybe not literally, but you are just being fed these things, and you are being conditioned without knowing that it is happening. And so these sources of information like media, social media outlets, and Google, that it can tailor and curate the information that you receive. And an example of this is also where vilification is used. It's a tender example, but during COVID, there were many expert opinions that differed from the mainstream ones in terms of how global society should respond to the pandemic, and then for masks and vaccines. But there was a tight control on the narrative that reached most people through network news and through social media. And so you think about that, these are highly impactful for individual lives and health, where information is not allowed to reach you. And it has very real life impacting consequences. He talks about, it goes through medical journals, situations, a little bit of academia, and philanthropy, how philanthropy is presented to us as this very noble thing, but it is often used as a public relations ploy and also to move money around. He talks about the Club of Rome, which was this organization founded in the 70s. It was Rockefeller funded, and they took it upon themselves to identify potential threats that would warrant global cooperation. And this is one of those very common situations where there's something that sounds a little bit good, or it sounds wise, and it definitely sounds like it could align with Baha'i visions for the world. Yay, global cooperation. But in fact, you have to question the motives. And some of the things that they came up with that would precipitate this forced global cooperation were global pandemics and climate catastrophe. And ever since then, we have seen a bizarre rise in the amount of discourse about the climate. And I'm not trying to diminish the climate, but that is also another situation where there are true experts who have dissenting views than the sort of green mainstream one that is being pushed. And it is censored from those normal people of us who don't know to look outside of these sources that we think have our best interests and are giving us the best information. Mehrtash mentioned some tactics that are used by government agencies and media outlets. One is decoys. Another is something called a fake binary. And you really see this a lot, and you see this on full display on like network news programs when they have pundits from like the so-called right and the so-called left, and they're arguing about climate change, or they're arguing about this or that topic. And the fake binary is where the actual scope of discourse is very limited, but within that limited sphere, heated debate is encouraged. This was something articulated by Noam Chomsky. He identified this situation. And so it looks like there is this like intellectual freedom occurring, but they're actually putting blinders. They're actually narrowing the scope of what can be discussed. And most of these issues are not a simple pro this, anti this. There's a wide scope of view and possibility, cause and effect, and there is a great deal of nuance. And we lose that in our soundbite society, and we lose that when we have this fake binary presented to us again and again and again. And the fake binary also feeds into our sort of tribal tendencies to pick a team and then just go along with what that team represents. And we are sovereign beings, and we have to really think for ourselves and understand that there's more than just these narrow confines. Another tactic that Noam Chomsky talked about was manufactured consent, where perhaps a society is inched towards the acceptance of certain ideas, and sometimes there is a catalyst that is not organic. It is an intentional catalyst. Perhaps like Pearl Harbor really opened the gates for acceptance of entering World War II, where it was manufactured consent. People ended up going along with it, but it was a strategic action. Also, he talks about the Great Reset, which was, you can find information from the WEF about it, different theories and plans for it in sort of an intellectual way. But you see, when COVID hit and they started implementing this, it was strangely well prepared for, given that the pandemic was unexpected. And also, one of the efforts of the Great Reset could very well be the destabilization of nations through forced migration. I'm getting into all kinds of hot topics, but go to the Substack and the YouTube yourself to get all the nitty gritty and all the sources here. It'll blow your mind and leave your jaw on the floor. Also, political leverage, and Mehrtash mentions the wonderful work of Whitney Webb. She wrote One Nation Under Blackmail. It will leave you a little bit depressed, this 2-volume tome about how very few people have made it to the heights of political careers, probably entertainment as well, but specifically politics, without being compromised with blackmail. And there's a lot to be said here. It's really sad and unfortunate. I'm sure the names Jeffrey Epstein and P. Diddy ring a bell for you. And yet, in a way, those situations, though there's public awareness, they haven't fully been exposed or prosecuted. We don't have the client lists. So there is the hint there that that's because these individual weirdos were not acting alone, but that it's part of a bigger network of blackmail and manipulation. Yes, I think there was more I was going to say about that, but there's a lot. So that's a wonderful overview of this just like juicy, amazing call to action here, which he offers long-term and short-term solutions, how we can start to address these. And long-term, remember what I was going to say. I remember what I was going to say about blackmail and how this aligns with spiritual principles, that Baha'is are called to have rectitude of conduct, and that if you are ambitious and you are invited to a party or a ranch or an island where drugs happen and weird things are said to happen, maybe you don't go. That Baha'u'llah's gifts are for our protection, and that blackmail is a very real thing, and it's very scary to think that that might be highly involved in the world that we live in and the information we receive, because there are deals going on and people are compromised and people are beholden because there's blackmail on them. So what triggered that was thinking about the spiritual principles here. The long-term solutions here are the aims of the Baha'i faith, the spiritual, social, and moral aims of the Baha'i faith the transformation of society through the individual's transformation of heart and spirit, where we grow into our true moral and spiritual stature of truthful, truth-seeking, investigating reality, seeing with our own eyes, and pursuing of justice, peoples. And we can all be working on that today. But as far as society, that is a long-term goal. So the short term is to be skeptical, to practice intellectual self-defense, to be aware of all of these forces that I've mentioned to you, and you can learn more about them in Mehrtash's series, and to not be sucked in, not be emotionally hooked, and not be tribal in your views, and to understand that there are conflicts of interest often at play in the information you receive and what you're not allowed to receive through some of these primary sources of transmission of information. So how do you move around that? Well, it would be great if you could do more of your own journalism, more of your own research, but that is what we want journalists for. And that's why it's so sad that some of that trust has been abused. But Mehrtash gives a couple of suggestions of journalists and outlets that may not be compromised, that may have less or no conflict of interest, where if they make a mistake, they correct it. They don't always agree with each other, which is a good thing. They're not always right, but they are aiming for transparency. And some of these that he suggests would be Racket News, Matt Taibbi, System Update, Glenn Greenwald, Public News, Michael Schellenberger, Full Measure News, Cheryl Atkinson, the Dark Horse Podcast with Brett Weinstein and his wife, Jeffrey Jackson of The High Wire, the Unbiased Podcast. I also enjoy Epoch Times. I think that they are a really good neutral news source, and there are some that are a little less neutral, but I think have good information. I'll just leave it at Joe Rogan. Not that he's a journalist, but that he has experts on occasionally in various fields, and they have long form discussions, which is really the key there. And also search engines you can use as an alternate or as a supplement to Google or DuckDuckGo, and these are Brave, Quant, QWANT, and Yandex, YANDEX. All right, my friends, you're going to go check out Skepticism, Sources of Information, and the Pursuit of Truth? Please do. Also, remember to like and subscribe. Thank you so much for spending a little bit of your day with me. Until next time, I wish you the best for playing your unique part in making this world a better place. I will catch you next time. Bye-bye.